What if I told you a Sister Wives star challenged the state of Utah, won a historic court battle, and then lost everything because of one shocking legal mistake? Before we reveal how it all unraveled, hit subscribe and join thousands of viewers who love untold stories the mainstream media misses. No one expected Cody Brown to become the center of one of the most unusual legal battles connected to reality television, because for decades, families living this lifestyle followed a simple rule: stay quiet, avoid attention, and never give authorities a reason to look in your direction. Yet everything changed when cameras arrived and the Brown family opened their lives to the public. What seemed at first like a television experiment quickly turned into something much bigger. Because the moment viewers were introduced to Cody, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, another audience was watching as well. People who were not interested in ratings or entertainment, but in the legal questions surrounding a family living openly in a way that had traditionally remained hidden from public view. The attention created excitement, curiosity, and controversy all at once, and before the first season had even fully established itself, discussions were already taking place about what the future might hold for the family. Rumors began spreading that officials were paying attention, and that possibility alone was enough to create uncertainty. Because even when no immediate action occurs, the idea that it could happen at any moment can change everything. Every conversation, every plan, and every decision suddenly carries additional weight. The Brown family faced a choice. They could continue living exactly where they were and hope nothing happened, or they could take steps to protect themselves from a situation that seemed increasingly unpredictable. Eventually, they decided to leave Utah and relocate to Nevada, creating distance between themselves and the growing cloud of uncertainty that had formed around them. For most people, that move would have marked the end of the conflict, a fresh start in a new location, and an opportunity to focus on family and television opportunities rather than legal concerns. But Cody Brown was not interested in simply moving on. What happened next surprised even people who followed legal issues closely, because instead of quietly accepting the situation, he chose to challenge it directly. And that decision transformed a family story into a national conversation. Suddenly, questions about personal freedom, privacy, religious expression, and government authority were no longer abstract debates taking place in classrooms and courtrooms. They were being discussed through the lens of a family millions of viewers recognized from television. As legal preparations began, the stakes continued to rise, because this was no longer just about one household. It was about whether laws that had existed for generations could withstand modern constitutional scrutiny. Supporters viewed the challenge as a chance to address issues they believed had remained unresolved for years, while critics questioned both the legal strategy and the likelihood of success. Regardless of which side people supported, one thing became impossible to ignore. Attention was growing rapidly. News outlets, legal commentators, and constitutional scholars all began examining the case because it touched on questions that extended far beyond reality television. Every development generated more discussion, and every discussion generated more interest, making the story larger than anyone could have imagined when the cameras first started rolling. Then came a moment that changed everything. A federal court ruling delivered what appeared to be a remarkable victory for Cody and his legal team. Headlines spread across the country, and many reports framed the outcome as historic. Observers described it as a major legal breakthrough, and supporters celebrated what they believed was a significant step forward for personal liberty. After years of uncertainty, the ruling seemed to validate the decision to fight rather than remain silent. Cody suddenly found himself in an extraordinary position. He was no longer simply a reality television personality. He had become a central figure in law. A legal story that was attracting nationwide attention. Interviews followed, public reactions intensified, and for a time, it appeared that the battle had been won. But beneath the excitement, a different story was developing, one that received far less attention from the public, because experienced legal observers understood something important. Cases are rarely finished after a single victory, especially when major legal questions are involved. Appeals exist precisely because one court decision is not always the final chapter. While celebrations continued, preparations for the next stage were already underway. State attorneys carefully reviewed the ruling and began constructing arguments that would eventually shift the entire direction of the case. Meanwhile, life inside the Brown family continued moving forward. Television production, family relationships, financial pressures, and everyday responsibilities did not pause simply because a courtroom victory had occurred. In fact, some of those challenges were becoming more complicated over time. Viewers watched evolving family dynamics unfold on screen, but many had no idea that another battle was quietly progressing behind the scenes, one capable of changing everything once again. Months passed, then years, and although public attention gradually moved toward other stories, the legal process continued advancing step by step beneath the surface. What made the situation particularly fascinating was that the issue ultimately destined to determine the future of the case was not the issue most people were discussing publicly. While commentators focused on constitutional principles and broader social questions, appellate lawyers concentrated on something far more technical, yet potentially far more powerful. Because in the legal world, procedural rules can sometimes matter just as much as the larger principles everyone is debating. As the appeal moved forward, something unusual began happening. Because while the public continued remembering the headlines celebrating victory, the legal reality was becoming increasingly uncertain. Behind closed doors, attorneys on both sides were preparing for a battle that would focus less on the emotional and constitutional questions that had captured national attention and more on the technical framework that determines whether a federal court can even hear a case in the first place. It was the kind of issue that rarely generates headlines, yet has the power to decide the outcome of some of the most important lawsuits in American history. And while most viewers following the sister wives story remained focused on the family itself, experienced legal observers understood that the future of everything Cody had achieved could depend on a single procedural question that many people had never heard of. As months turned into years, the contrast between public perception and legal reality became more dramatic, because from the outside, it looked as though the family had already changed history. Articles continued referencing the original ruling, commentators discussed its implications, and supporters pointed to it as evidence that meaningful legal change was possible. But inside the appellate process, none of those assumptions carried any special weight. Appellate judges were not evaluating public opinion, television ratings, or media narratives. They were examining legal standards, and those standards required answers to very specific questions, one of which centered on whether the family had experienced a legally recognizable injury sufficient to bring the challenge at all. It sounds simple when stated that way, but the consequences were enormous, because if the answer was no, then every argument, every hearing, every celebration, and every headline connected to the earlier victory could suddenly lose its foundation entirely. Meanwhile, life inside the Brown family continued evolving in ways that made the situation even more complicated. The pressures of maintaining multiple households remained significant. Public scrutiny never disappeared, and the realities of life under constant observation created challenges that no courtroom victory could solve. Relationships shifted, expectations changed, and small disagreements sometimes grew into larger issues, creating an atmosphere where uncertainty seemed to exist both inside and outside the courtroom. Yet, despite these challenges, Cody continued speaking confidently about the significance of the earlier ruling, and many supporters shared that confidence, believing the legal victory represented something permanent, something durable, something capable of surviving what procedural outcome prevented the constitutional questions from receiving a final resolution. The debate itself remained significant, and many observers acknowledged that the case had succeeded in bringing national attention to issues that might otherwise have remained largely invisible. At the same time, the result demonstrated the challenges involved in creating lasting legal change, especially when attempting to address long-standing laws through the courts rather than through legislative action. For Cody, the experience represented a remarkable mixture of achievement and frustration. On one hand, he had participated in a legal challenge that attracted national attention, generated widespread discussion, and produced a ruling that briefly altered the legal landscape. On the other hand, the ultimate outcome meant that the victory many people remembered was no longer in effect, creating a complicated legacy that resisted simple description. Some viewed the effort as courageous, others saw it as a cautionary tale, and many regarded it as a combination of both. Because regardless of where someone stood on the underlying issues, there was little doubt that the decision to challenge the law openly required an unusual willingness to accept risk, particularly given the public attention surrounding the family. Years later, the broader story continued evolving. Family relationships changed dramatically, public interest remained strong, and new developments often overshadowed the legal battle that had once dominated headlines. Yet for those who look closely at the history of the case, its significance remains difficult to ignore. It serves as a reminder that legal change rarely follows a straight path, that courtroom victories can be temporary, and that procedural requirements often shape outcomes just as powerfully as the substantive arguments people remember most. It also illustrates the difference between winning an important ruling and securing a lasting transformation, because those are not always the same thing. Sometimes a decision creates momentum without creating permanence. Sometimes a legal battle influences public conversation, even when it does not achieve every objective supporters originally hoped for. And sometimes the most enduring impact of a case comes not from the final outcome, but from the questions it forces society to consider. The story of Cody Brown and this legal challenge reflects all of those realities. It is a story about ambition, risk, persistence, and the complicated nature of change. It is a story about what happens when individuals decide to confront institutions much larger than themselves, and about the unpredictable ways those confrontations can unfold over time. Perhaps most importantly, it is a story that reveals how legal systems operate beneath the headlines. Because while public attention often focuses on dramatic